Picture a cramped backstage hallway buzzing with electricity. Somewhere down the corridor, guitars wail in a sound check, lights flicker, and a restless audience grows louder by the minute. At the center of this whirlwind stands a young Joan Jett, shoulders squared, jet black hair framing her face, eyes filled with defiance. She's barely old enough to drive, yet she's already had experiences most people twice her age would struggle to handle. Even then, you might have felt a sense of history in the making. This teenage guitarist radiated something so potent and raw, it was destined to become legendary. But behind that iconic black leather jacket and tough girl persona lurked another story, one fraught with sexism, abuse, health scares, financial ruin, tragic losses, and heartbreak. Over the decades, Joan Jett has fought for survival in ways that make the cliches of sex, drugs, and rock and roll sound like child's play. What follows is a deep dive into her darker chapters, the ones that forged her spirit and molded the pioneer she ultimately became. Buckle up, because even if you think you know everything about the queen of rock and roll, there's a lot here that might surprise you. In the mid-1970s, while most teenage girls wrestled with curfews, prom invitations, or the usual high school dramas, Joan Larkin, soon to be known as Joan Jett, was stepping onto stages in dingy clubs and massive festivals alike. She was a founding member of the Runaways, an all-female rock band that burst onto the scene with an energy so intense you could practically see sparks flying when they played. The idea of teenage girls playing loud, raw rock and roll was jarring to a music industry accustomed to bubblegum pop princesses, or at most female folk singers with acoustic guitars. The Runaways were brash, in-your-face, and unapologetically sexual in their marketing. They didn't tiptoe around delicate topics. They stomped on them in platform boots. Yet, even with the hype and attention they generated, few people realized how toxic the environment was behind the scenes. From the moment they formed in 1975, the Runaways had to fight on multiple fronts. They faced hostile male crowds hurling slurs, executives who viewed them as a novelty act, and an exploitative manager by the name of Kim Fowley. He relished the shock factor these teenage rockers commanded, but had little regard for their well-being. Stories abound of how the band, Joan, Cherie Currie, Lita Ford, Jackie Fox, and Sandy West, were forced into humiliating publicity stunts, faced verbal abuse in rehearsals, and even endured being spat on during gigs. Fowley's iron-fisted approach might have toughened them up on stage, but off stage, it took a brutal toll on their mental health. While the Runaways were making headlines for their badass image, they were also just teenage girls who sometimes cried in bathrooms after shows because the violence and misogyny felt suffocating. Joan, who had always dreamt of forging a path in rock, initially tried to ignore the darker currents swirling around them. She wanted to believe they could blaze a trail for women in an industry that often relegated them to sidekick status. But the deeper she got into the Runaways world, the more complicated everything became. Kim Fowley was no typical manager. He was known for intense tactics, which included screaming at the band members and pitting them against each other to maintain control. There was also the glaring reality of financial mismanagement. While the band toured constantly and sold records, the money didn't trickle down to the girls themselves. Their parents might see a few checks, but nobody was getting rich except maybe Fowley and the labels. It was a classic story. Young talent gets exploited by those with power. The difference here was that the exploited happened to be underage girls, making the power imbalance that much more egregious. By the late 1970s, tension had reached a boiling point. The Runaways were exhausted from relentless touring, battered emotionally, and financially unstable despite their fame. Joan, having left home as a minor to chase her dreams, found herself in a surreal predicament. She could walk out onto a stage in Japan and be greeted by thousands of screaming fans. The Runaways were huge there. Then return to her motel and realize she had barely enough cash for a meal. When the band finally dissolved in 1979, the breakup was akin to a messy divorce, leaving everyone traumatized. Joan tried to keep it together, but the cracks were already showing. She was only in her early 20s, but life had chewed her up and spat her out, leaving her with a broken band, few personal savings, and a mounting sense of desperation. With the Runaways over, Joan suddenly realized her entire identity was tied up in something that no longer existed. She had poured her energy, talent, and youth into a band that collapsed under exploitation and infighting. The immediate aftermath felt like standing in the wreckage of a collapsed building. There was no roadmap for a female rock star going solo in the late 70s, especially not one with a reputation for being loud and unapologetic. Record labels weren't exactly tripping over themselves to sign a rebellious woman who strummed power chords with the same gusto as her male peers. As a result, Joan ended up in a financial and emotional black hole. There are stories of her living in a rundown trailer, struggling to afford everyday expenses, and battling a deep depression. This was also the time she turned to heavy drinking, trying to drown out the sense of failure and heartbreak. Enter the Sex Pistols, Steve Jones and Paul Cook, with whom she recorded her first solo album in 1980. On paper, that collaboration sounded like a match made in punk heaven. The Runaways had a certain punkish edge, and the Sex Pistols were, well, the Sex Pistols. But it turned out that the music industry wanted none of it. That debut solo effort was rejected by 23 different labels, an astonishing number when you consider how brilliant it was. The rejection stung, each one feeling like a personal slap in the face. Joan's confidence wavered, but not enough to make her quit. With the help of producer and eventual longtime collaborator Kenny Laguna, she resorted to selling the album out of the trunk of their car after shows. Picture that for a second. A young woman who had already toured the world, forced to hawk her records in parking lots because every major label had told her she wasn't good enough. Things got darker still. The breakup of the Runaways had triggered a period of wild partying for Joan, which escalated to the point of near disaster. She contracted a severe heart infection, likely endocarditis, a condition that can strike IV drug users and people living extremely hard lifestyles. Though the exact details are murky, the bottom line is that she ended up in the hospital in critical condition. The very heart that pumped adrenaline into her electrifying performances was under siege. Doctors warned her that if she didn't change course, she might not live to see 30. Facing mortality at such a young age was a wake-up call, hammering home the reality that she was walking a tightrope between living her rock and roll dream and dying by its hand. For someone as tenacious as Joan Jett, though, crisis often became the catalyst for action. She refused to succumb to despair. After recovering from her heart scare, she emerged with a renewed sense of purpose. Together with Kenny Laguna, she formed Joan Jett and the Blackhearts. What followed was a dogged battle against industry gatekeepers who still doubted that a woman could front a successful rock band. Joan's path was not only unusual because she was female, but also because her style, straight-ahead rock tinged with punk energy, didn't neatly fit the glossy pop mold that dominated the airwaves. Undeterred, she and her band toured incessantly, playing clubs where they sometimes had to show the audience, chord by chord, that these were real rock songs, not just gimmicks. The original pressing of her album titled Joan Jett was largely self-funded, reissued in 1981 as Bad Reputation. It became something of a slow burn success, generating enough buzz to land a deal with Boardwalk Records. Suddenly, the door that had been slammed in her face 23 times was pried open. In the midst of Joan's personal struggles, her former Runaways bandmates were also descending into their own private hells. Cherie Currie, once the blonde bombshell frontwoman of the Runaways, spiraled into addiction. She survived a near-fatal overdose that could have ended her life at any moment. While Joan wasn't directly responsible for Cherie's problems, and the two weren't always close after the band's breakup, it nonetheless weighed heavily on her. She had watched the Runaways form with such hope, only to see them collapse under the weight of exploitation, poor management, and the heartbreaks that so often plague young talent. Having walked that harrowing path herself, Joan felt a deep sadness that Cherie was waging a war with demons that almost claimed her life. Decades later, Joan would speak about the regret she felt at not being able to help Cherie more during those darkest times. By the time the 1990s rolled around, Joan was no longer the broke, desperate musician she'd been in the late 70s. She had hits under her belt, big ones. I Love Rock and Roll became an anthem that propelled her into mainstream success, and tracks like Crimson and Clover further solidified her place in rock history. But success didn't mean immunity from the toll of a relentless touring schedule. Her devotion to live performance was legendary. She believed in paying her dues night after night, city after city, often barking out her rebellious lyrics until her vocal cords felt like they might tear. Sure enough, she developed nodules on her vocal cords in the mid-1990s, a scenario that left her facing a terrifying possibility: losing her voice. For a singer, that's like a dancer losing a leg. She was forced to cancel shows, something she almost never did, and spend weeks in near silence to heal. If you know Joan Jett's persona, you know how excruciating that must have been. It wasn't just a physical injury, it was a psychological blow, reminding her that life on the road had costs beyond the usual exhaustion and homesickness. A different sort of heartbreak came in 2004 when Richie Cordell, co-writer of I Love Rock and Roll and a key figure in shaping Joan's career, passed away from pancreatic cancer. It's easy to forget how important mentors can be, especially in a cutthroat industry that rarely shows mercy. Cordell was one of the few who believed deeply in Joan's talent from the outset, championing her music and fighting alongside Kenny Laguna to get her the break she deserved. Losing him was both a personal and professional blow, pulling a crucial ally from her corner. It reminded Joan that even as her legacy grew, her circle of longtime supporters was growing smaller. Then came October 21st, 2006, the day Sandy West, the Runaways' fiery drummer, succumbed to lung cancer at the age of 47. For anyone who followed the Runaways, Sandy was more than just the band's percussive force. She was a hard-on-sleeve rebel who lived and breathed rock and roll. Joan and Sandy had bonded in the early days, two teenagers with big dreams, hammered into shape by Kim Fowley's Machiavellian grip. While the band's breakup had frayed their once-tight friendship, Joan never forgot the raw energy Sandy brought to their performances. Receiving the news of Sandy's passing was like a punch to the gut, bringing back all the memories of those early tours, the late-night songwriting sessions, and the camaraderie that only bandmates can truly understand. In public statements, Joan described Sandy as a phenomenal drummer and a true rebel, a testament to the lasting influence she had on Joan's life. In private, friends say, it shook her more than she let on. Amid these public tragedies, Joan also confronted personal losses that weren't as widely documented. Over the 2000s and 2010s, she lost both of her parents, James and Dorothy Larkin. Their deaths were not splashed across tabloids, but for Joan, this was a deeply private form of grief. She had always been something of a lone wolf, forging her path in an industry that seldom offered stable ground. Losing the two people who'd known her from her earliest days, not as Joan Jett the rock icon, but as Joan Marie Larkin, was a quietly devastating blow. She has mentioned how her mother's passing inspired the track Hard to Grow Up on her 2013 album Unvarnished. The title says it all. No matter how famous you become or how many gold records you stack up, losing a parent can unmoor you in ways you never anticipated. And for someone who had carved out her identity with a near mythical level of independence, facing those responsibilities alone was sobering. Reflecting on her journey, you can see the layers of resilience that Joan Jett has accumulated. She's the epitome of someone who has been knocked down physically, emotionally, professionally, time and again, yet she always seems to find a way to stand back up, guitar in hand. Consider the pattern. She was dismissed early on because she was a teenage girl in a rock band. She was exploited financially, left nearly homeless, endured a near-fatal heart infection, faced repeated rejections from record labels, battled industry sexism, lost close friends, dealt with injuries that threatened her ability to perform, and suffered personal bereavements that forced her to confront her own vulnerability. Through it all, she not only survived but continued to innovate, leading the wave for female rock artists to be taken seriously.